Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I was 8 years old when it happened, back in the summer of 2010. The memory remains etched in my mind with a clarity that defies the passage of time. My name is Daniel, and what I experienced during our family trip to Shady Pines campground transformed my understanding of fear. The excitement began when my father, James, announced we would be staying in one of the lakeside cabins rather than camping in tents as we usually did. My mother, Diane, had been hesitant about camping since her back surgery the previous winter, so this seemed like the perfect compromise. "It'll be just like camping," Dad said, ruffling my hair, "but with actual beds and a roof over our heads." Mom smiled at that. "And indoor plumbing," she added. "Don't forget that part." I remember watching them pack with barely contained enthusiasm. For years, Dad and I had camped on a small island in the middle of Shady Pines Lake. We'd fish during the day and tell stories around the campfire at night. Those memories were golden, untainted by the shadow that would later fall over our family outings. The drive to Shady Pines took nearly 3 hours. I sat in the back seat with my backpack full of comics, action figures, and a new flashlight Dad had bought me specifically for this trip. The winding roads grew narrower as we approached the campground, tall pines creating tunnels of green that occasionally broke to reveal glimpses of the glittering lake beyond. "We're almost there," Dad said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Excited, buddy?" I nodded vigorously, pressing my face against the window. The car slowed as we turned onto the gravel road leading to the campground entrance. A wooden sign, weathered by years of rain and sun, welcomed us to Shady Pines. Even now I can picture that sign perfectly, the paint peeling at the edges, a small carving of a pine tree in the corner. The camp manager, Mr. Henderson, greeted us at the office. He was an older man with leathery skin and hands calloused from years of outdoor work. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but there was something in his gaze that seemed to look through rather than at you. "Cabin 7, he said, handing my father a key attached to a wooden tag. "It's one of our newer ones, right by the lake. Beautiful spot." As Mr. Henderson processed our paperwork, I wandered around the small office. Taxidermied fish hung on the walls alongside faded photographs of smiling families and record-breaking catches. A glass case near the counter displayed various campground souvenirs, keychains, postcards, and t-shirts with the Shady Pines logo. "First time staying in one of our cabins?" Mr. Henderson asked, his attention suddenly fixed on me. I nodded, suddenly shy under his scrutiny. "You'll like it," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Though some kids say they hear strange things at night. The wind through the pines can sound like someone whispering, you know." My mother shot him a disapproving look, and he quickly changed his tone. "But it's beautiful. You're going to have a wonderful time." He handed me a small carved wooden figure of a bear, a welcome gift for our younger guests. As we left the office, I examined the wooden bear. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the wood dark and smooth. Its eyes were tiny dots of black that seemed to follow my movements. "What do you say, Daniel?" Mom prompted. "Thank you," I called back to Mr. Henderson, who waved from the doorway. "Sleep tight," he replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I didn't know it then, but those words would take on a terrible irony in the nights to come. Cabin 7 stood at the end of a short trail, partially hidden by a cluster of tall pines. It was smaller than I had imagined. A single-room structure with a narrow porch and windows that reflected the afternoon sun like vacant eyes. The exterior was log cabin style, though the logs were actually manufactured siding designed to give the appearance of rustic charm. "Home sweet home," Dad announced, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The interior was simple, A small kitchenette with a mini fridge and microwave, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a small sofa, and 2 beds. A queen-sized one against the far wall, and a wooden bunk bed tucked into the corner. A door beside the kitchenette led to a tiny bathroom with a shower stall. I immediately ran to the bunk bed. "I call the top bunk," I shouted, already climbing the ladder built into the frame. The wooden rungs felt rough under my hands, and the entire structure creaked slightly under my weight. "Are you sure?" Mom asked, setting her bag on the queen bed. "You might roll off in your sleep." "I won't," I promised, already imagining how it would feel to sleep up high, like being in a tree fort. Dad laughed. "Let him have his adventure, Diane. I'll take the bottom bunk." I sprawled across the top bunk, testing the mattress. It was thin but comfortable enough, covered with a faded blue bedspread that smelled faintly of detergent and pine. A small window next to the bed looked out into the woods behind the cabin, the view mostly obscured by pine branches. While my parents unpacked, I explored every inch of our temporary home. The cabin's wood paneling gave it a cozy feel, though there were water stains on the ceiling and a few spots where the flooring had warped. A rack of antlers hung above the door, real ones, not decorative replicas, and a painting of the lake at sunset adorned the wall opposite the bunks. What I remember most clearly was the silence. Coming from our house in the suburbs, I wasn't used to the absence of background noise. No distant traffic, no hum of appliances, no neighbors' voices. Here, when conversation stopped, the silence pressed in like something physical. "Can we go to the lake?" I asked, breaking one such silence. "Let's get settled first," Mom said, organizing items in the small closet. "Then we'll have the whole afternoon for exploring." After unpacking, we walked down to the lake. The water stretched out before us, vast and still, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding pines like a perfect mirror. A small dock extended about 20 feet into the water, and several canoes were tied up alongside it. "Remember when we caught that huge bass last year?" Dad asked, pointing toward the island in the center of the lake. "Right off the northern shore of the island," I nodded enthusiastically. "Can we go fishing tomorrow?" "Absolutely," he promised. "First thing in the morning." We spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the campground. I rode my bike along the gravel roads while my parents walked behind, holding hands and talking quietly. The other cabins were similar to ours, though most were occupied by couples without children. I remember seeing only one other kid, a girl slightly older than me who was reading on the porch of cabin 3. She waved as I rode past, but her parents called her inside before we could talk. As the sun began to set, we returned to our cabin for dinner. Mom had packed sandwiches for our first night, and we ate at the small wooden table, planning our activities for the week ahead. "Fishing tomorrow," Dad said, marking it on the campground map with a pen. "Then maybe hiking the North Trail in the afternoon." "And swimming," I added. "Don't forget swimming." The evening passed pleasantly enough. Dad taught me how to play gin rummy, and Mom read her novel on the sofa. The cabin grew darker as night fell, the single overhead light casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus, and occasionally, we heard the distant hoot of an owl. By 9 o'clock, my eyelids were growing heavy. The excitement of the day, combined with the fresh air, had tired me out completely. "Bedtime for you, I think," Mom said, noticing my yawns. I changed into my pajamas and brushed my teeth in the tiny bathroom. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age, and the fluorescent light buzzed intermittently, flickering just often enough to be unsettling. When I emerged, Dad was already in the bottom bunk reading a fishing magazine. "All set for your first night in the top bunk?" he asked. I nodded, climbing the wooden ladder. The rungs creaked under my weight, a sound that would later take on horrifying significance. Mom kissed me goodnight, tucking the thin blanket around me. "Sleep well, sweetheart. If you need anything, we're right here." I settled into the unfamiliar bed, my new flashlight and a comic book beside my pillow. The mattress crackled slightly, protected by a plastic cover beneath the sheet, and the bunk frame squeaked whenever I moved. Through the small window, I could see only darkness and the vague silhouettes of pine branches swaying in the night breeze. For about 20 minutes, I read my comic by flashlight, the small beam creating a perfect circle of light on the colorful pages. Gradually, my eyes grew heavier, and I clicked off the light, settling into the darkness that would soon become my enemy. I'm not sure how long I slept before waking. It might have been minutes or hours. In the disorienting darkness of the cabin, time seemed to lose all meaning. What I do know is that when I opened my eyes, the darkness was absolute. My first thought was confusion. At home, my bedroom was never completely dark. The glow of the hallway nightlight always seeped under my door, and the street lamp outside my window cast patterns across my ceiling. Here, the darkness was total, pressing against my eyes like a physical presence. I blinked repeatedly, trying to force my vision to adjust. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the blackness. The outline of the window, the darker rectangle of the bathroom door, the faintest hint of my father's sleeping form in the bunk below. I could hear his deep, rhythmic breathing, occasionally punctuated by a soft snore. From across the room came my mother's lighter breathing. I'm not sure what woke me initially. Perhaps a noise from outside, or simply the unfamiliarity of the bed. Whatever the cause, sleep now seemed impossibly distant. I shifted positions, trying to find comfort on the thin mattress, but the plastic cover crinkled loudly with every movement. The night sounds of the forest pressed against the cabin walls. Wind rustled through pine needles, creating a constant whispering backdrop. Occasionally, branches would scrape against the roof or walls with a sound like fingernails. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, a high, keening sound that raised the hair on my arms. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated before turning it on. Something about the darkness felt watchful, as if turning on the light would announce my wakefulness to whatever lurked in the shadows. Instead, I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to control my breathing, counting slowly as I inhaled and exhaled. Minutes stretched endlessly. I tried every trick I knew to fall back asleep, counting sheep, repeating the alphabet backward, imagining myself floating on a cloud. Nothing worked. Each time I approached the edge of sleep, something would jolt me back to full alertness. A creak from the cabin, a sudden silence in the forest's night chorus, the feeling of being watched. The woods outside had fallen unnaturally quiet. The constant whisper of wind through pines had ceased, and even the distant calls of night creatures had gone silent. The silence was worse than the sounds had been, a waiting, expectant quiet that seemed to hold its breath. I lay perfectly still, my own breathing shallow and quick. Every instinct warned me not to move, not to make a sound. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the cabin. The darkness felt heavier, more concentrated, particularly in the corner farthest from my bunk. Time became meaningless as I stared into that corner, trying to convince myself that the deeper darkness there was just a trick of my imagination. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that something was gathering in that space. Something that absorbed rather than reflected the faint ambient light. Just as I was about to wake my father, I heard it. Laughter. Not human laughter. Nothing that could have come from a person's throat. It began as a low, gurgling chuckle, like water flowing over stones, then transformed into something higher pitched and fractured. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the dark corner, from outside the window, from directly beneath my bunk. I froze, unable even to scream. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came the second sound, the one that haunts my nightmares to this day. A soft, deliberate creak of wood. Then another, and another. Something was climbing the ladder to my bunk. Each creak corresponded perfectly to the rungs of the wooden ladder built into the frame. Creak, one rung, pause, creak, second rung, pause. The methodical pace made it worse somehow, suggesting a terrible patience, an absolute certainty. I could see the ladder from where I lay, but there was nothing visible on it. The rungs bent slightly under weight that I couldn't see, the wood protesting with each new step. Whatever was climbing toward me was invisible in the darkness, or perhaps made of darkness itself. When the fifth rung creaked, I finally found my voice. "Dad!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. "Mom! Help!" The climbing stopped instantly. My parents startled awake, my father sitting up so quickly he banged his head on the bottom of my bunk. "What? What is it?" he called, his voice thick with sleep. "There's something climbing up to me," I sobbed, curling into the farthest corner of my bunk, as far from the ladder as possible. The overhead light came on as my mother found the switch. The sudden brightness made me squint, but I immediately looked toward the ladder. Nothing was there. The rungs were empty, the wooden frame still. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Mom asked, hurrying to the bunk bed. "Did you have a bad dream?" "No," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "I heard it laughing, and then it was climbing up the ladder to get me." Dad was examining the ladder now, running his hand along the wooden frame. "There's nothing here, buddy. You must have been dreaming." "I wasn't asleep. I was awake for a long time before it happened." My parents exchanged that look, the one adults give each other when they think a child is being irrational. It only made me more frantic. "I heard it," I insisted. "First it laughed, and then it started climbing." "What laughed?" Mom asked gently, sitting on the edge of my father's bunk. "What did it sound like?" I struggled to find words. "Not like a person. Like something pretending to be happy but really isn't. And wet somehow." Even to my own ears, the description sounded inadequate, failing to capture the bone-deep wrongness of that sound. "There's nothing in the cabin with us," Dad said firmly, checking the locks on the door and windows. "Everything's secure." "I want to come down," I whispered. Dad helped me climb down from the top bunk. I refused to touch the ladder, and Mom made me a cup of hot chocolate from a packet she'd packed. My hands shook so badly that she had to hold the mug for me. "It was just a nightmare," she soothed, stroking my hair. "The first night in a strange place can do that." "Can I sleep with you?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Mom looked at Dad, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said. "Just for tonight." I ended up wedged between my parents in the queen bed, too frightened even to close my eyes. They fell back asleep eventually, but I remained awake until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains, listening to the cabin's every creak and groan, terrified of hearing that laughter again. Morning arrived with merciful brightness, sunlight streaming through the windows and transforming the cabin into a completely ordinary space. The corner that had seemed to harbor concentrated darkness was just that, a corner containing nothing more threatening than a broom leaning against the wall. I watched my parents move around the cabin, preparing breakfast and discussing plans for the day with casual normalcy. How could they not feel it? The cabin had changed during the night, taking on a malevolent personality that the sunshine couldn't quite erase. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. "Sleep okay after all the excitement?" Dad asked, ruffling my hair as he passed. I nodded, not wanting to admit that I hadn't slept at all. Something told me that acknowledging my fear would only make it more real, give it more power. "Great! How about we head out for some fishing after breakfast? The bass are supposed to be biting early this time of year." Part of me wanted to refuse, to insist that we pack our things and leave immediately. But the greater part, the part that still wanted to be the brave son my father expected, nodded again. "Yes, please." Breakfast was simple. cereal with milk from the mini fridge, and sliced bananas. I pushed the food around my bowl, taking mechanical bites when my mother glanced my way. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a constant, low-level nausea that intensified whenever I looked at the bunk bed. "Maybe we should look into that nightmare," Mom said quietly to Dad when she thought I wasn't listening. He seemed really scared. Dad dismissed her concern with a wave. "Kids have nightmares. New place, strange sounds. He'll be fine once he gets used to it." But I wasn't fine. Even in the bright morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin seemed to hold its breath when we weren't speaking, waiting for something. I stayed close to my parents as we prepared for our fishing trip, never allowing myself to be alone in any part of the cabin. Outside, the day was perfect. The sky stretched blue and cloudless above the pines, and the lake sparkled in the sunlight. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water, along with the distant sounds of other campers starting their day. Everything seemed normal, safe. We walked to the dock where the rental boats were kept. Mr. Henderson was there, checking the engines on several small motorboats. "Morning, folks," he called cheerfully. "Perfect day for fishing." "That's what we're hoping," Dad replied, signing the rental form. "Any tips on where they're biting?" As the men discussed fishing spots, Mr. Henderson's gaze drifted to me. His smile faltered slightly. "Rough night, son?" he asked, his voice lowered. I stared at him, startled by the question. How could he know? "Daniel had a bit of a nightmare," Mom explained. "First night in a strange place." Mr. Henderson nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Cabin 7, right? Yeah, some folks have trouble sleeping there, especially kids." A chill spread through my chest. "What do you mean?" He seemed to catch himself, glancing at my parents before answering. "Oh, nothing specific. Just that it's one of our more isolated cabins. The forest sounds can be pretty strange if you're not used to them." Dad finished the paperwork, and we climbed into the small boat. As Mr. Henderson helped push us off from the dock, he leaned close to me. "If it happens again," he said quietly, "try not reacting. Sometimes attention is what it wants." Before I could ask what he meant, Dad started the motor and we pulled away from the dock. I looked back to see Mr. Henderson watching us, his expression unreadable in the morning light. The fishing trip should have been enjoyable. The lake was calm, the fish were biting, and Dad was in his element, showing me how to bait the hook and cast properly. We caught several bass and a good-sized pike, which Dad said we could cook for dinner. But my mind kept returning to Mr. Henderson's words and the events of the night before. What had he meant by, "attention is what it wants"? And who were the "some folks" who had trouble sleeping in cabin 7? "Dad," I said as we drifted in a quiet cove, our lines trailing in the water, "has anyone else said weird things happen in our cabin?" Dad looked up from adjusting his lure. "What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that?" "Mr. Henderson said people have trouble sleeping there." Dad frowned. "He shouldn't be saying things like that to a kid. No wonder you had nightmares." "But..." "No buts, Daniel. There's nothing wrong with the cabin. It's just a building made of wood and nails, and wood makes noise when it expands and contracts with temperature changes. That's all you heard." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. I turned my attention back to my fishing rod, but the seed of doubt had been planted. If there was nothing unusual about Cabin 7, why had Mr. Henderson specifically mentioned it? We returned to shore around midday with our catch. Mom had prepared a picnic lunch, which we ate at one of the tables near the lake. Other families were out enjoying the fine weather, swimming, boating, playing frisbee on the narrow strip of beach. Everything seemed so normal, so safe in the daylight. After lunch, we hiked one of the trails that wound through the forest surrounding the lake. The path was well maintained but narrow, forcing us to walk single file in many places. Dad led the way, pointing out interesting plants and the occasional wildlife. Mom followed, taking photographs of particularly scenic spots. I stayed close behind her, unwilling to be last in line with the forest at my back. The trail eventually opened onto a small clearing with a magnificent view of the lake and surrounding mountains. A wooden bench had been placed at the edge of the clearing, offering weary hikers a place to rest and enjoy the vista. "Perfect timing," Dad said, checking his watch. "We can rest here for a bit before heading back." As my parents sat on the bench, admiring the view and consulting the trail map, I wandered around the edge of the clearing. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine branches, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Despite my lingering unease, the beauty of the place was undeniable. At the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by a large boulder, I found a small wooden structure. At first, I thought it was some kind of trail marker or perhaps a birdhouse. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a miniature cabin. An exact replica of Cabin 7, down to the smallest detail. My heart began to race as I circled the structure. It couldn't be a coincidence. The placement of the windows, the small porch, even the number 7 carved into the tiny door, everything matched our cabin perfectly. But what truly froze my blood was what I saw when I peered through one of the tiny windows, a small wooden bunk bed with a minuscule ladder leading to the top bunk. And sitting on that top bunk was a crude wooden figure, roughly the size and shape of an 8-year-old boy. I backed away, stumbling over tree roots in my haste to return to my parents. "Mom, Dad," I called, my voice higher than normal. "I found something weird." They followed me reluctantly, Mom clearly tired from the hike, and Dad checking his watch with increasing frequency. But when I led them to the spot where I'd found the miniature cabin, there was nothing there. Just the boulder and undisturbed forest floor. "It was right here," I insisted, scanning the ground in disbelief. "A tiny cabin that looked exactly like ours." "Daniel," Mom said gently, "that's enough. We're not playing games right now." "I'm not playing. It was here." Dad put his hand on my shoulder, his grip slightly too firm. "Son, we're all tired. Let's head back to the real cabin and get some rest before dinner." "But..." "No more, Daniel." His voice left no room for argument. The walk back to camp was silent and tense. I knew what I had seen, but I also knew that insisting would only make my parents more dismissive. Instead, I retreated into my thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since our arrival. The miniature cabin, Mr. Henderson's warning, the climbing sounds on the ladder. They were connected somehow. I was certain of it. But how? And more importantly, what would happen when night fell again? As the afternoon waned, a bank of dark clouds moved in from the west, bringing with them a premature twilight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the breeze that had been pleasant earlier now carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. "Looks like we might get some rain," Dad observed as we returned to the cabin. "Good thing we got our hiking in early." Inside, Mom began preparing dinner, the small space quickly filling with the smell of frying fish and the potatoes she'd brought from home. Dad cleaned our fishing gear on the porch, the door propped open to let in the last of the daylight. I sat at the table, methodically coloring in a page from the activity book Mom had packed, but my attention was constantly drawn to the bunk bed in the corner. In the fading light, the wooden ladder seemed to stand out in stark relief against the shadows, each rung distinct and somehow threatening. "Can I sleep with you guys again tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mom and Dad exchanged a look. "Daniel," Dad said, setting down the tackle box he'd been organizing. "You're 8 years old. That's too old to be sleeping with your parents because of a bad dream." "It wasn't a dream," I muttered, pressing the crayon so hard against the paper that it snapped. "What was that?" "Nothing." Mom wiped her hands on a dishcloth and came to sit beside me. "Sweetheart, we understand you were scared last night, but sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially in new places. There's nothing in this cabin that can hurt you. What if I sleep on the bottom bunk with Dad and you take the top bunk? I suggested desperately. Dad shook his head. Your mother needs the regular bed for her back, and I'm too big for the top bunk. It has to be you up there. Or you could sleep on the sofa, Mom offered, glancing at the small two-seater against the wall. It was barely long enough for me, let alone for either of my parents. I nodded quickly. I'll take the sofa. Are you sure? Dad asked, frowning. It won't be very comfortable. I'm sure. He sighed, clearly disappointed by what he saw as my childishness, but he didn't argue further. All right, but just for tonight. Tomorrow you're back in the bunk. Dinner should have been delicious. The fresh fish was perfectly cooked, and Mom had even made her special herb butter to go with the potatoes. But each bite stuck in my throat, and I had to force myself to swallow. The approaching night filled me with a dread so profound it was almost physical, a weight pressing down on my chest. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the first spatters of rain against the cabin windows. The pines swayed and creaked, their shadows dancing across the walls in the lamplight. Every few minutes, thunder rumbled in the distance, drawing steadily closer. Perfect night for ghost stories, Dad joked as he cleared the dinner plates. Mom shot him a warning look. James, don't. What? A little scare is part of the camping experience. He winked at me. Right, buddy? I nodded mechanically, not wanting to seem even more childish in his eyes. But inside I was screaming. Didn't he understand? The last thing I needed was more fear. As if on cue, lightning flashed, momentarily flooding the cabin with harsh white light. In that instant, I thought I saw something move in the corner near the bunk bed. A shadow that didn't quite match any object in the room. A darkness deeper than mere absence of light. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and the cabin's electricity flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Perfect timing, Dad muttered in the sudden darkness. Everyone stay put. I'll find the flashlights. I heard him moving carefully across the room, bumping into the edge of the table with a muffled curse. Mom's hand found mine in the darkness, her palm cool and reassuring against my sweaty fingers. It's just a power outage, she whispered. Nothing to be afraid of. But in the darkness, my other senses seemed heightened. I could smell the lingering aroma of dinner, the mustiness of the sofa cushions, and underneath it all, something else. A faint, sour odor like spoiled meat or stagnant water. Dad's triumphant, "Aha!" preceded the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. He handed another flashlight to Mom and kept the third for himself. The golden circles of light seemed pitifully small against the pressing darkness. The storm must have knocked out the power, he said, moving to check the circuit breaker on the wall. Might be out for a while. Should we go to bed early? Mom suggested. There's not much else we can do without electricity. The thought of trying to sleep while that thing, whatever it was, moved freely in the darkness was unbearable. Can't we play a game or something? I pleaded. Dad checked his watch, illuminating the face with his flashlight. It's only 8:30. I guess we could play cards for a bit. We gathered at the table, the 3 flashlights positioned to create a pool of light in the center. Dad dealt a hand of Go Fish, but my attention kept straying to the edges of the light, where shadows seemed to pulse and shift with a life of their own. The storm intensified, rain now hammering against the roof and windows. Occasionally, the wind would gust with such force that the entire cabin would shudder, the timbers groaning in protest. Each time this happened, I would flinch, certain that it was not the wind, but something else testing the cabin's strength, looking for a way in. Or perhaps it was already inside. As we played, I became aware of a pattern to the sounds within the cabin. Beneath the storm's fury, there was a subtle rhythm, a soft creak, pause, another creak, pause, moving slowly around the perimeter of the room, always just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Dad, I whispered during Mom's turn. Do you hear that? Hear what? He asked, sorting his cards. The creaking. It's moving around the room. He cocked his head, listening. It's just the wind, Daniel. Old buildings make noise during storms. But it wasn't the wind. The wind was chaotic, random. This was deliberate, methodical, and it was drawing closer to our table with each circuit of the room. I tried to focus on the game, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my cards. When my turn came, I fumbled the draw, sending cards scattering across the table. Sorry, I mumbled, gathering them up. As I reached for a card that had fallen to the floor, my flashlight beam swept across the lower portion of the room, and I saw them. Footprints. Wet footprints on the wooden floor leading from the front door to the area behind me. Not human footprints. These were wrong somehow. Too long. The toes splayed at impossible angles, the heel narrow and deeply indented. And they glistened in the flashlight beam, not with water, but with something darker, more viscous. I scrambled back into my chair, the card forgotten. "There's footprints!" I gasped, pointing the flashlight beam toward the floor. "Look!" Mom and Dad both directed their lights where I was pointing, but the floor was empty, just bare wood, dry and unmarked. "Daniel, that's enough," Dad said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I understand you're scared of the storm, but making things up isn't helping." "I'm not making it up. They were right there." "I think it's bedtime," Mom interjected, gathering the cards. "We're all tired, and everything seems worse in the dark." Despite my protests, they began preparing for bed. The sofa was made up with sheets and a blanket from the closet, and Mom laid out our clothes for the morning. Dad checked that the door and windows were securely locked, though I noticed he double-checked the door latch. "Try to get some sleep," Mom said, kissing my forehead. "The storm will probably be over by morning." They retreated to their beds, Mom to the queen, Dad to the bottom bunk, leaving me alone on the sofa with my flashlight and racing thoughts. I lay rigid under the blanket, the flashlight clutched so tightly in my hand that my fingers ached. "Mom?" I called softly. "Dad?" "Go to sleep, Daniel," came Dad's gruff reply from the bunk. I wanted to tell them about the footprints, to make them understand that something was in the cabin with us, but the words stuck in my throat. They wouldn't believe me anyway. As I lay there, the storm gradually began to subside. The thunder became more distant, the rain lightened to a gentle patter, and the wind dropped to a whisper. Under normal circumstances, these changes would have been comforting. But as the storm quieted, the other sounds became more noticeable. The creaking had stopped its circuit of the room and was now concentrated in one area, the space between the sofa and the front door. Each creak was like a footstep, shifting weight from one foot to another. Waiting. I kept my flashlight trained in that direction, though I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was making the noise. The beam illuminated nothing but empty floor and the edge of the welcome mat by the door. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My parents' breathing had deepened and slowed, indicating they had fallen asleep. The storm had moved on entirely, leaving behind an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof. And then, just as my exhausted eyes began to close despite my terror, I heard it again. The laugh. It started as before, a low, gurgling chuckle that seemed to bubble up from some deep, dank place. But this time it didn't stop. It grew, becoming more frenzied, more unhinged with each passing second. It wasn't coming from any specific location anymore, but seemed to fill the entire cabin, reverberating through the walls and floor. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. My throat had closed in terror, my vocal cords frozen. I could only lie there paralyzed as the laughter surrounded me. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, hungry. I heard movement, but not from my parents' beds. Something was moving toward the sofa. Not footsteps exactly, but a sort of wet, sliding sound punctuated by that now familiar creak of weight shifting on old wood. My flashlight beam shook violently as I tried to track the sound, but it revealed nothing. Whatever was approaching was staying just beyond the reach of the light, or perhaps was invisible to it. The sliding, creaking movement stopped directly beside the sofa. I could feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air that smelled of rot and stagnant water. Though I couldn't see it, I knew it was leaning over me, inspecting me with whatever passed for its eyes. A drop of something cold and viscous fell onto my cheek, then another, and another. Not water, it was too thick, too cold. It ran down my face like congealed fat, leaving a trail of numbness wherever it touched. With the last of my strength, I finally managed to scream. My scream shattered the cabin's silence like glass breaking. My parents bolted awake, my father nearly falling from the bottom bunk in his haste. "What? What is it?" he shouted, his voice thick with sleep and alarm. "It's here," I sobbed, scrubbing frantically at my face. "It's right next to me. It's dripping on me." Mom reached the light switch, flipping it uselessly several times before remembering the power was out. "James, check on him," she urged, fumbling for her flashlight. Dad directed his beam toward me, scanning the area around the sofa. "There's nothing here, Daniel. You were having another nightmare." "Feel my face," I insisted, tears streaming down my cheeks. "It was dripping on me." He reluctantly touched my cheek, then pulled his hand away with a frown. "You're just sweating, son. It's warm in here with the power out." "No." I was beyond caring how I sounded now, beyond worrying about appearing childish. "It wasn't sweat. It was cold and thick and wrong." Mom had joined us now, her flashlight adding another beam to the small island of light around the sofa. "James," she said quietly, "look at the floor." Dad directed his beam downward, and I followed suit. There, on the wooden floor beside the sofa, was a small puddle of something dark and viscous. As we watched, it seemed to shrink, as if being absorbed into the wood itself. "What the hell?" Dad muttered, kneeling for a closer look. He reached out a finger as if to touch it, but Mom grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't touch it." The puddle continued to shrink, the wood darkening as it absorbed the substance. Within seconds, it was gone entirely, leaving only a slightly darker patch on the floor as evidence it had ever existed. Dad stood up slowly, his expression troubled. "It must be a leak from the roof," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The storm was pretty intense. "James," Mom said, her voice strained, "the roof is not leaking that substance." For the first time, my father seemed at a loss for words. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the spot where the puddle had been. "I want to leave," I said, my voice small but determined. "Please, can we go home?" Dad sighed deeply. "Daniel, it's the middle of the night. We can't just pack up and leave." "Why not?" Mom asked, surprising us both. "If Daniel is this frightened, maybe we should consider it." "Because it's pouring rain, the roads will be slick, and we'd have to pack everything in the dark," Dad listed, gesturing with his flashlight. "It's not practical. We'll discuss it in the morning." "I'm not staying here," I insisted, clutching my blanket around me like armor. "It's going to come back." "What is?" Dad demanded, his patience clearly at an end. "What exactly do you think is in this cabin with us?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I describe the presence I felt, the wrongness of that laughter, the impossible weight that seemed to press against reality wherever it moved? "I don't know," I admitted finally. "But it's bad. Really bad." Dad rubbed his face wearily. Look, I understand you're scared, but there's a rational explanation for everything that's happened. The creaking is the cabin settling. The puddle is a leak we haven't located yet. And the laughter? He hesitated. The laughter was probably just the wind through the trees. It wasn't the wind, I said stubbornly, and it climbed the ladder. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes, he explained for what felt like the 100th time. The ladder was creaking because the temperature dropped after we went to bed. Mom placed a hand on his arm. James, maybe we should... Whatever she was about to suggest was cut off by a sharp knock at the cabin door. We all froze, flashlight beams converging on the door in perfect synchronicity. The digital clock on Dad's wrist read 2:17 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? Mom whispered. Dad handed her his flashlight. Stay here with Daniel. James, don't... But he was already moving toward the door, his shoulders squared with determination that couldn't quite mask his unease. He peered through the small window beside the door, then stepped back with a frown. It's Henderson, he said, sounding surprised. The camp manager. He unlocked the door and opened it a few inches, keeping his body positioned to block anyone from entering. Mr. Henderson, is everything all right? The man who stood on our porch looked nothing like the friendly camp manager who had greeted us upon arrival. His clothes were disheveled, his hair wild as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his expression that sent a chill through me, a mixture of fear and grim resignation. I heard the scream, he said without preamble. All the way from my cabin. Dad's posture stiffened. My son had a nightmare. Everything's fine. Henderson's gaze shifted, looking past Dad to where Mom and I huddled on the sofa. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he understood, that he knew exactly what was happening in Cabin 7. It wasn't a nightmare, he said quietly. Was it, son? Before Dad could respond, Henderson pushed past him into the cabin, closing the door firmly behind him. He moved with a nervous energy, checking the corners of the room with quick, darting glances. Mr. Henderson, Mom began, this is highly inappropriate. You need to leave, he interrupted, his voice low and urgent. Pack your things and get out now, while it's resting. While what is resting? Dad demanded, anger beginning to replace his initial shock. What are you talking about? Henderson ignored him, addressing me directly. What did you see? What did it do? I swallowed hard. It laughed, and climbed the ladder the first night. Tonight it was by the sofa. It dripped on me. He nodded as if this confirmed something. It's escalating faster than usual. You need to go. Now. Now wait just a minute, Dad interjected, stepping between Henderson and me. You can't come in here in the middle of the night frightening my family with this nonsense. It's not nonsense, Henderson snapped. And deep down, you know that. You saw something on that floor, didn't you? Something that shouldn't exist. Dad's momentary silence was answer enough. What is it? Mom asked, her arm tightening around my shoulders. What's in this cabin? Henderson ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than he had appeared during our check-in. I don't know what to call it. Not exactly. But it's been here as long as the campground has existed. A ghost? Dad scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. No. Henderson shook his head firmly. Not a ghost. Ghosts were once people. This was never human. A profound silence followed his words, broken only by the soft patter of rain on the roof. Most adults can't perceive it, Henderson continued, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. Children can, though, especially sensitive ones. He nodded toward me, like your boy here. Why didn't you warn us? Mom demanded, her voice tight with fear and anger. Henderson's laugh was bitter. Would you have believed me? Would you have turned around and driven home if I'd told you an ancient, malevolent entity resides in Cabin 7 and has a particular fondness for children? You could have given us a different cabin, Dad pointed out. They're all booked. Summer season. Henderson's expression darkened. And it doesn't always manifest. Sometimes months go by without an incident, I hoped. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. It doesn't matter what I hoped. You need to leave. Now. In the middle of the night, in this weather? Dad gestured toward the window where rain still streaked the glass. Better than staying here, Henderson insisted. It's only going to get worse. First night it makes contact. Second night it begins physical manifestation. Third night... He glanced at me, then apparently thought better of whatever he'd been about to say. There won't be a third night, not for your son. Mom stood abruptly. I'm packing our things. James, get the car ready. To my surprise, Dad didn't argue. The certainty in Henderson's voice, combined with what we'd all witnessed, seemed to have finally broken through his skepticism. What should we do until we're ready to leave? He asked Henderson, his voice gruff but no longer challenging. Stay together. Keep the flashlights on. And whatever you do, don't acknowledge it if it returns before you leave. What do you mean, acknowledge it? Mom asked, already gathering our belongings and shoving them haphazardly into bags. Don't look directly at it. Don't speak to it. And for God's sake, don't touch anything it leaves behind. Henderson glanced at the darkened spot on the floor. Attention feeds it, validates it, makes it stronger. I remembered his words from earlier that day. Sometimes attention is what it wants. It made a terrible kind of sense. Dad had begun collecting our fishing gear and other belongings from around the cabin. Why do you stay here? He asked Henderson. If you know what this thing is, why not leave? Henderson's expression was grim. Someone has to warn people. Someone has to try to minimize the damage. He sighed heavily. And it's not just here. If I left, it would eventually follow. These things, they form attachments. A sudden chill swept through the cabin, causing the flashlight beams to waver. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, and with it came that smell again, rot and stagnant water, stronger now. It's coming back, Henderson whispered, his face paling. Hurry. We moved with frantic energy, throwing our belongings into bags without regard for organization. Dad made 2 trips to the car, loading our gear in the pouring rain while Mom and I finished packing inside, Henderson standing guard at the door. As we worked, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive. The air felt thick, resistant, as if we were moving through invisible syrup. The smell intensified, and the darkness between our flashlight beams seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Almost done, Mom announced, zipping the last bag. Just need to get our toiletries from the bathroom. I'll get them, I volunteered, wanting to prove my bravery despite my terror. No, Henderson said sharply. Stay where we can see you. But it was too late. I was already halfway to the bathroom door, my flashlight beam bobbing ahead of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, sweeping the light across the small space. The beam caught something in the mirror above the sink, a reflection that couldn't possibly have been mine. For the briefest instant, I saw a face, if it could be called a face. It had no definable features, just areas of deeper shadow where eyes and mouth should be, all within a roughly head-shaped mass of absolute darkness. I stumbled backward, a scream rising in my throat, but before it could escape, the door slammed shut between me and the others, plunging me into darkness as my flashlight flew from my hand and shattered against the wall. Daniel! I heard my parents shout in unison, their voices muffled by the closed door. Something moved in the darkness with me. I could hear it. That wet, sliding sound accompanied by the creak of weight shifting. It was circling me in the confined space, drawing closer with each revolution. I pressed myself against the door, fumbling desperately for the handle. My fingers closed around it, but it refused to turn. Something on the other side was holding it shut. "Mom! Dad!" I managed to cry out. "Help me!" I heard them pounding on the door, trying to force it open. Henderson's voice rose above the commotion. "The entity has manifested fully. We need to break down the door." Inside the bathroom, the circling had stopped. Whatever shared the space with me was directly in front of me now, so close I could feel its cold presence against my skin. The smell was overwhelming, no longer just rot and stagnant water, but something far worse, something ancient and fundamentally wrong. Then came the laugh, that terrible gurgling sound that had haunted my nights. But this time, it was followed by words, if they could be called words. The sound was like water forcing its way through mud, each syllable bubbling and distorted. "Found you?" The doorknob suddenly gave way beneath my hand, and I fell backward as my father and Henderson burst into the bathroom. Dad scooped me up immediately, cradling me against his chest as he backed away. Henderson wielded a large flashlight like a weapon, sweeping its beam around the small space. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Did you see it?" I could only point mutely at the area in front of where I had been standing. There was nothing visible there now, but the air seemed to warp slightly, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day. "Get him out of here," Henderson ordered. "Get in your car and drive. Don't stop until you're miles away from Shady Pines." "What about you?" Mom asked, already guiding us toward the cabin door. Henderson's smile was grim. "I'll handle things here. I always do." We didn't wait for further explanation. Dad carried me to the car, Mom following with the last of our bags. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but lightning still flickered on the horizon, illuminating the campground in brief, harsh flashes. As Dad started the engine, I looked back at Cabin 7. Henderson stood on the porch, watching us. But he wasn't alone. A deeper shadow stood beside him, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, vaguely human-shaped but wrong in fundamental ways. "Dad," I whispered. "It's there. On the porch with Mr. Henderson." Dad didn't look back. He put the car in gear and accelerated down the gravel road, tires spitting stones behind us. "Don't look at it, Daniel," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Remember what Henderson said. Don't acknowledge it." I tore my gaze away from the cabin, focusing instead on the road ahead as we passed through the campground gates and onto the main highway. Only when we were several miles away, the campground long lost to the darkness behind us, did any of us speak again. "Are we safe now?" I asked, my voice small in the car's quiet interior. Mom reached back from the passenger seat to squeeze my hand. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe now." But even as she spoke, I noticed Dad checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, his expression tense. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Not physically, perhaps, but in some other, more insidious way. A memory had attached itself to us, a knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. And in that knowledge lay a terrible vulnerability, as if by perceiving the thing in Cabin 7, we had somehow opened ourselves to it. I huddled in the back seat, watching the rain-slicked road disappear beneath our tires, and wondered if we would ever truly escape what we had encountered at Shady Pines. We drove through the remainder of the night, stopping only when the gas gauge dipped dangerously low. Dad pulled into a brightly lit service station around 5 a.m., the fluorescent lights a blessed relief after hours of darkness broken only by our headlights and the occasional flash of distant lightning. While Dad filled the tank, Mom took me inside to use the bathroom. The normalcy of the convenience store was jarring after our experience, the bored cashier flipping through a magazine, the hum of refrigerator cases, the tinny music playing over ceiling speakers. It felt like we had stepped back into the real world after visiting somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the usual rules didn't apply. "Are you hungry?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral as we browsed the snack aisle. She was trying so hard to act normal, to pretend we were just a family on an early morning road trip. I shook my head. The thought of food made my stomach turn. Every few minutes, I would catch myself checking over my shoulder, scanning shadowy corners with wary eyes. The fluorescent lights left no place for darkness to hide, but that didn't stop me from looking. When we returned to the car, Dad was already behind the wheel, staring straight ahead with an unfocused gaze that suggested his thoughts were far away. He started slightly when Mom opened the passenger door. "All set?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Mom nodded, passing him a large coffee she'd bought inside. "Where are we heading?" "Home," he said simply. "We can be there by noon if the traffic's light." None of us mentioned Shady Pines or the abrupt end to our vacation. It was as if we had made an unspoken agreement not to discuss what had happened until we were safely home, as if talking about it might somehow summon it back to us. I must have fallen asleep eventually, lulled by the car's motion and the absolute exhaustion of fear. When I awoke, we were pulling into our driveway, the familiar sight of our house bringing tears to my eyes. "We're home," Mom said softly, reaching back to touch my knee. "Everything's going to be okay now." But was it? Could things ever really be okay again after what we had experienced? I wasn't sure. The rest of that day passed in a fog. We unpacked the car mechanically, putting away our belongings without comment. None of us mentioned the items we'd left behind in our haste to escape. Dad's favorite fishing rod, Mom's novel, my action figures. They seemed a small price to pay for our safety. That night, as bedtime approached, a new fear gripped me. Would it be waiting for me in my bedroom? Had it somehow followed us home, hidden in the shadows of our car or in the darker corners of our memories? "Can I sleep with you tonight?" I asked Mom as she tucked me into my own bed, my voice small but determined. She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Dad was preparing for bed in their room. "Daniel," she began gently, "you're safe here. This is our home. Nothing from that place can reach you here." "Please," I whispered, hating the tears that sprang to my eyes but unable to stop them. "Just for tonight." She sighed, then nodded. "All right. Just for tonight." I slept between my parents that night, and for several nights afterward. Dad didn't object as I had expected him to. Something had changed in him since our experience at Shady Pines. A certainty had been shaken. A fundamental confidence in the orderliness of the world. Weeks passed, and gradually we established a new normal. During the day, it was almost possible to believe that nothing extraordinary had happened. We went about our routines. School for me, work for my parents. We laughed at dinner, watched television in the evenings, did all the ordinary things that families do. But the nights remained difficult. I developed elaborate bedtime rituals, checking under the bed and in the closet, leaving the hallway light on, positioning my stuffed animals in a protective circle around my pillow. Mom and Dad indulged these behaviors without comment, perhaps understanding that they were my way of regaining some sense of control. Dad researched Shady Pines campground online, though he tried to hide this from me. I caught glimpses of his computer screen sometimes. Forum posts from other campers, historical records of the area, old newspaper articles. I never asked what he found, and he never volunteered the information. Mom became jumpier, startling at unexpected sounds and keeping lights on throughout the house well into the night. She began sleeping with a small lamp on her bedside table, something she had never done before. As for me, I developed a heightened awareness of darkness. Not just the absence of light, but the quality of shadows, the weight of them. I could sense the difference between ordinary darkness and something else. Something watching, waiting. I learned to trust this awareness, to respect it. About a month after our return, I woke in the middle of the night to find my room colder than usual. The digital clock on my bedside table read 3:17 a.m., what I would later learn is called the dead hour, when the veil between worlds is supposedly at its thinnest. My nightlight cast a weak glow across the room, barely penetrating the shadows that gathered in the corners. As I lay there, fully awake and instantly alert, I became aware of a presence, not in my room, but nearby. Somewhere in our house, something was moving. I slipped out of bed and padded to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against it. The hallway beyond was silent, but it was a silence that felt expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Slowly, carefully, I turned the doorknob and eased the door open a crack. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow from the bathroom nightlight at the far end. Nothing moved in that limited field of view, but the feeling of a presence remained, stronger now. I should have been terrified. After what had happened at Shady Pines, any hint of that supernatural darkness should have sent me running to my parents' room. But something was different this time. The presence didn't feel threatening. It felt protective. With a courage I didn't know I possessed, I opened the door wider and stepped into the hallway. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath fogging slightly in the chill air. At the end of the hall, a shadow moved. Not the amorphous, consuming darkness from the cabin, but something more defined, more purposeful. It was roughly the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. As I watched, it turned toward me, though I couldn't make out any features in the gloom. For a long moment, we regarded each other across the length of the hallway. Then it raised a hand, a clear gesture of reassurance or farewell, and faded into the darkness. The next morning, we received a letter. There was no return address, but the postmark was from the town nearest to Shady Pines. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message written in a shaky hand. "It won't bother you again. I've made sure of that. But be cautious in dark places. Once you've seen them, they can sometimes see you too. G.H." Dad read the note 3 times, then silently passed it to Mom. Neither of them explained it to me, but they didn't need to. I understood that G.H. was Gerald Henderson, the camp manager who had helped us escape. What I didn't understand until years later was the sacrifice his message implied. That was the last direct contact we had with anything related to Shady Pines, but the experience left its mark on all of us. Dad became more open-minded about things he couldn't explain. Mom developed an interest in protective folklore and filled our house with subtle wardings. Horseshoes over doorways, bundles of herbs hung in windows, lines of salt on windowsills that she would replace monthly. As for me, I never again slept on the top bunk of a bunk bed. Even now, as an adult, I can't bring myself to climb those wooden ladders. The sound of them creaking under weight is enough to send ice through my veins. But I gained something too, an awareness of the world beyond the visible, beyond the explainable. Most people go through life never encountering the darker truths that exist in the shadows. I sometimes envy them their innocence, but I can't regret the knowledge. It has made me cautious but not fearful, respectful of darkness but not ruled by it. And on certain nights, when the wind sounds like laughter and shadows seem deeper than they should be, I sense that protective presence again, a guardian standing between me and whatever waits in the darkness. I don't know if it's Henderson or something else entirely, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. Some experiences change you forever. What happened at Shady Pines Campground in the summer of 2010 was such an experience for me. It opened my eyes to a reality most people never glimpse, and while that vision came with a burden of fear, it also came with a deeper understanding of the world and its mysteries. I've never returned to Shady Pines, and I never will. Some places should be left alone, their secrets undisturbed. But I've made my peace with what happened there, and with the knowledge that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. The darkness taught me to fear, but it also taught me to survive. And in the end, that's the most important lesson of all. I'm 23 now, sitting in my apartment with the lights on despite the late hour. Outside, rain taps against the windows, and thunder rumbles in the distance. Storms still make me uneasy, though I've learned to manage the anxiety they provoke. My laptop is open before me, the screen displaying the website I've been monitoring for months. Shady Pines campground closed permanently, the headline announces. The article beneath it cites declining tourism and maintenance issues as the reasons for the closure, but I know better. I click through to another tab where I've compiled news reports spanning the 15 years since our family's experience. Disappearances mostly. Campers who wandered off and were never found. Children who vanished from tents and cabins only to turn up miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. And deaths, too few to establish a pattern that might attract serious investigation, but too many for coincidence. And always, in the background of these stories, brief mentions of the camp manager who'd worked at Shady Pines for over 30 years, Gerald Henderson, described by all as helpful, concerned, somehow always first on the scene when things went wrong. Until 3 months ago, when Henderson himself disappeared. The official report says he went fishing on the lake and never returned. His boat was found drifting empty, no sign of struggle or accident. The authorities concluded he had fallen overboard and drowned, though his body was never recovered. I know different. The letter I received the week after his disappearance confirmed what I had suspected. It's done, the note read in that same shaky handwriting. Cabin 7 is empty now. I've taken it with me, as far from others as I can. Don't come looking. Live well. GH. My phone rings, startling me from my thoughts. It's Dad, calling much later than he usually would. Did you see the news? He asks without preamble when I answer. About Shady Pines? Yes. A long pause follows, filled with the static of unsaid things. My parents and I have never fully discussed what happened that summer. We've referenced it obliquely over the years, acknowledging its impact on our lives without examining the details too closely. Do you think it's really over? Dad finally asks, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions. I think Henderson made sure of it, I reply. Another pause, shorter this time. Your mother wants to know if you're still coming for dinner this weekend. The abrupt change of subject is so typical of my father that I almost laugh. Yes, I'll be there. Tell her I'm bringing dessert. Good. That's good. He clears his throat. Daniel, do you ever... I'm fine, Dad. I say gently, understanding the question he can't quite formulate. I haven't had the dreams in years. This isn't entirely true. The nightmares still come occasionally. Dark shapes climbing wooden ladders, wet footprints on hardwood floors, laughter that bubbles up from impossibly deep places. But they're just echoes now, memories rather than visitations. Good, Dad says again. That's good. Well, we'll see you Sunday. After we hang up, I return to my research. It's become something of an obsession over the years. Not just Shady Pines, but other places like it. Places where the veil between worlds is thin, where things that shouldn't exist find ways to touch our reality. I've documented dozens of such locations across the country, abandoned buildings where shadows move against the light, stretches of forest where hikers report time distortions, hotel rooms where guests wake to find themselves watched by things that retreat into walls at the first sign of acknowledgement. My research has brought me into contact with others who have had similar experiences, people who have glimpsed the darkness and lived to remember it. We share information, warnings, methods of protection. We've formed a loose network of watchers, cataloging incursions and keeping track of patterns. It was through this network that I learned of Henderson's final plan. He'd been containing the entity in Cabin 7 for decades, binding it through means he never fully explained to anyone. But he was growing old, his strength failing, and he knew he couldn't maintain the binding much longer. So he made a choice, the only choice that would ensure the safety of others. He lured the entity onto the lake, to the very center where the water runs deepest, and he took it down with him into the darkness, a final sacrifice to end a lifetime of guardianship. The storm outside intensifies, lightning flashing in rapid succession. I close my laptop and move to the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. In their trails, I can almost see patterns forming, meaningful arrangements just beyond my comprehension. This is what remains of my experience at Shady Pines. Not fear, but awareness. An understanding that reality has depths most people never plumb, currents that move beneath the surface of normal perception. I turn from the window and methodically check the apartment. Doors locked, salt lines intact on the windowsills, protective symbols subtly incorporated into the decor. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what I know exists. As I prepare for bed, I think of Henderson and hope that whatever peace is possible has found him. I think of my parents, who learned to accept a world broader and stranger than they had believed possible. And I think of my 8-year-old self, terrified on a top bunk as something climbed toward me in the darkness. We survived, all of us. Changed, certainly, marked in ways that can never be erased. But we survived. I switch off the bedside lamp but leave the hallway light on, a concession to old habits. As darkness fills the room, I sense rather than see the now familiar presence take up its station in the corner. My guardian, my protector, following me from home to college to this small apartment. Good night, I whisper to the darkness, and in the silence that follows, I find comfort rather than fear. Some battles continue long after the initial conflict ends. Some enemies never fully retreat. But I've learned that the same is true of allies, of the forces that stand against the darkness. As I drift towards sleep, I carry this knowledge with me like a talisman. Darkness exists, but it does not rule unchallenged. And those who have seen it, who have named it and survived it, are never truly alone in their vigilance. This is the legacy of Cabin 7. This is what remains when terror fades and wisdom takes root. This is how I live now, eyes open, mind aware, spirit unbowed by the weight of knowing. In the hallway beyond my bedroom door, a floorboard creaks softly. I smile into the darkness and close my eyes. I am a lifelong resident of southern Oklahoma, where endless farmland stretches toward every horizon like a brown-green ocean frozen in time. I've called this place home since I was 12, when my parents fled the suffocating concrete maze of New York City for the wide-open spaces of the Great Plains. The move transformed them. Their constant urban anxiety melted away, replaced by the calm that only comes from watching sunrise paint the sky without a single building to obstruct the view. Sometimes the relentless pace of city life breaks people before they even realize they're drowning. Oklahoma burns hot and dry for most of the year, the sun beating down mercilessly on cracked earth that drinks desperately from the rare storms that roll across our flat landscape. Winter brings bone-deep cold that seeps through every layer of clothing, and rain comes so infrequently that each drop feels like a gift. But when storms do arrive, they're magnificent and terrifying spectacles. The flat terrain offers no obstacles to the massive weather systems that crawl across the sky like living things, their thunder shaking loose stones from gravel roads, and their lightning painting masterpieces against the endless canvas of prairie sky. I had always loved these storms, until October 15th, 2019, when I was 32 and my younger brother Danny was 24. That day changed everything I thought I knew about the power of nature and the fragility of human survival. We had planned a weekend hiking trip in southeastern Oklahoma, where the flat plains give way to the rolling forested hills of the Ouachita Mountains. Both of us craved the outdoor adventures that our family had always used as an escape from daily stress. The American wilderness offers such incredible diversity of landscapes that we made it our mission to explore as many different ecosystems as possible. Despite our 8-year age gap, Danny and I had developed a strong hiking partnership over the years. Our occasional arguments on previous trips had mellowed as we both matured, and we'd learned to rely on each other's strengths. The wilderness seemed to strip away the petty irritations of civilized life, leaving only the essential human connection that binds family together. It was like taking a solo journey of self-discovery, but with the security of having someone to watch your back when things went wrong. The southeastern region of Oklahoma presents a dramatic contrast to our home territory. Instead of endless flatland, ancient hills covered in dense forests rise and fall like sleeping giants. The area receives significantly more rainfall than the plains, creating lush vegetation that seems almost tropical compared to the sparse prairie grass we knew. Pine and oak trees grow to enormous sizes when left undisturbed, their massive trunks and sprawling canopies creating cathedral-like spaces beneath their branches. We felt like we were entering an alien world as we drove east from our bed and breakfast that morning. The landscape gradually transformed from open farmland to rolling hills thick with vegetation. Ancient trees pressed close to the narrow roads, their branches forming tunnels that filtered the sunlight into moving patterns of gold and green. The air itself felt different, heavier, more alive, carrying scents of rich earth and growing things that we rarely experienced on the plains. Our destination was a vista point high on one of the ridges, where we planned to set up camp for the night and watch the sunrise over the forested valley below. We'd studied topographical maps and online reviews, building expectations of breathtaking views that would reward our climb with natural beauty beyond anything we'd seen before. But as we hiked upward through the increasingly thick forest, the day began to take an ominous turn that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The afternoon sun was already sinking lower than we'd planned when Danny and I reached the steeper portions of the trail. We'd gotten a later start than intended, partly due to my insistence on double-checking our gear, and partly because of unexpected road construction that had delayed our drive. Now we were racing against time, trying to reach the summit before full darkness fell and made setting up camp dangerous. The forest around us seemed to grow more oppressive with each step upward. Trees that had appeared majestic from a distance now loomed overhead like towering sentries, their thick trunks blocking out more and more of the remaining daylight. The canopy above was so dense that even in full afternoon we moved through a perpetual twilight world where shadows shifted and danced with every breeze. Danny walked ahead of me, his longer legs eating up the trail with efficient strides. He'd always been the navigator on our trips, with an intuitive sense of direction and timing that I envied. I focused more on reading the environment, watching for signs of weather changes, identifying edible plants, and staying alert to the subtle signals that nature constantly broadcasts to those who know how to listen. And nature was definitely trying to tell us something that day. The air pressure had been dropping steadily since we started climbing, creating a heavy, oppressive feeling that made each breath feel insufficient. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze when we started, was growing stronger and more erratic. It would calm to complete stillness for several minutes, leaving the forest in unnatural silence, then suddenly gust through the trees with a moaning sound that raised goosebumps on my arms. "Feel that?" I called to Danny, who had stopped to check our progress on his GPS device. He looked up from the small screen and tilted his head, listening to the wind moving through the pine boughs above us. "Storm coming?" he said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Question is how big and how fast." I nodded, studying the small patches of sky visible through gaps in the canopy. The blue was gradually being replaced by darker clouds that seemed to be building with unnatural speed. The air carried that distinctive metallic scent that comes before lightning storms, a smell like hot copper and ozone that makes your teeth ache. "We need to pick up the pace," I said, adjusting the straps of my backpack to redistribute the weight that seemed to grow heavier with each upward step. Danny consulted his map again. "About a half-mile to the ridge. If we push hard, we can make it before the weather hits." What neither of us said out loud was our shared concern about camping on an exposed ridge during a thunderstorm. But the alternative, trying to set up in the dense forest where we couldn't see the sky, seemed even worse. At least on the ridge, we'd have warning of what was coming. The forest seemed to be holding its breath as we climbed higher. The usual sounds of wildlife had faded away until we heard only our own footsteps on the leaf-covered trail and the increasingly urgent whisper of wind through the trees. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if every living thing in these woods was preparing for something terrible. Birds that had been singing throughout our climb suddenly fell silent. The absence of their calls created an eerie vacuum that made our own breathing and heartbeats sound unnaturally loud. I found myself glancing upward more frequently, searching the gaps between branches for signs of what was coming. The temperature began to drop as well, and I could feel moisture building in the air. My shirt, which had been soaked with sweat from the climb, now felt clammy and cold against my skin. Danny pulled a windbreaker from his pack and shrugged into it without stopping, his movements quick and efficient. "There," he said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the trees seemed to thin out. "I can see more sky." I looked where he was pointing and felt a mixture of relief and dread. We were close to our destination, but the sky that was becoming visible through the thinning canopy was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of violence. As we pushed through the last stretch of dense forest, the wind suddenly picked up with frightening intensity. Trees around us began to sway and creak ominously, their branches rubbing against each other with sounds like fingernails on chalkboard. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sharp crack of a tree limb giving way under the pressure. That's when I caught my first glimpse of what was circling high above the forest canopy, barely visible against the darkening clouds. Something large and dark was riding the wind currents, with an ease that defied the growing storm. At first I thought it might be a hawk or eagle, but the scale seemed wrong. Whatever it was moved with purpose and intelligence, as if it was watching and waiting for something. I didn't mention it to Danny. Not yet. But a cold dread was beginning to settle in my stomach as we approached the ridge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far more dangerous than just a thunderstorm. The ridge opened before us like a gateway to another world. After hours of climbing through the claustrophobic tunnel of dense forest, the sudden expanse of open sky was both liberating and terrifying. The vista stretched for miles in every direction, rolling forested hills fading into blue-gray haze on the horizon. Under normal circumstances, it would have been breathtaking. But these were not normal circumstances. The storm clouds overhead had transformed into something that looked less like weather and more like a living creature. They roiled and twisted with internal movement, shot through with veins of electricity that flickered without sound. The air itself felt charged, making the hair on my arms stand up and filling my mouth with the taste of copper pennies. Danny dropped his pack and stood at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the approaching tempest. "Jesus," he whispered, then caught himself. "I mean, God Almighty. Look at the size of that thing." The storm front stretched across the entire horizon, a wall of darkness advancing toward us with frightening speed. Lightning flickered continuously within its depths, creating a strobe effect that made the landscape below appear to jump and shift like images in an old film reel. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since we'd reached the summit, and the wind was now strong enough to make standing upright a challenge. "We need to get the tent up fast," I shouted over the growing roar of wind. "This is going to be a bad one." We worked with desperate efficiency, unpacking our gear and fighting against the gusts that tried to tear everything from our hands. The tent fabric snapped and billowed like a sail as we struggled to get it properly positioned. I had to lie across one corner to keep it from blowing away while Danny hammered stakes into the rocky ground. As I lay there holding down the tent, I found myself staring up at the sky, watching the play of lightning within the clouds. That's when I saw it again. The large, dark shape circling high above us. It was definitely a bird, but unlike any I'd ever seen. Even at this distance, I could tell it was massive, with wings that seemed to span an impossible width. It rode the violent air currents with an ease that suggested this was its natural element, as comfortable in the storm as a fish in water. But what disturbed me most was how it seemed to be watching us. Every few circles it would dip lower, as if getting a better look at our small campsite on the exposed ridge. There was something intelligent and calculating about its movements, something that made every instinct in my body scream warnings. "Danny," I called, still pinning down the tent corner. "Look up. Tell me what you see." He paused in his stake hammering and craned his neck toward the sky. For a long moment he was silent, and I wondered if the bird had disappeared into the clouds. Then his face went pale. That's a big bird," he said quietly. "How big do you think?" He watched for another moment as the creature completed another lazy circle above us. "From this distance? Hard to say. But if I had to guess." He paused as if reluctant to voice his estimate. "Maybe 8-10 foot wingspan. Could be bigger." A chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature ran through me. Birds of prey with 10-foot wingspans were not native to Oklahoma. Hell, they weren't native to North America. The largest raptors in our region topped out at maybe 4 feet, and even the massive condors of California only reached 9 feet at most. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Danny shook his head, still watching the sky. "I don't know. Never seen anything like it." The first fat raindrops began to fall as we finished securing the tent. They hit with surprising force, each one feeling like a small pebble thrown from the sky. Within minutes, the gentle drops had become a steady downpour, and within minutes after that, a torrential deluge that turned the world into a gray curtain of water. We scrambled into the tent, just as the first real lightning bolt split the sky directly overhead. The thunder that followed was so loud and immediate that it felt like the mountain itself was cracking apart beneath us. The sound didn't just hit our ears, it reverberated through our chests and bones, a physical force that left us gasping. "We're too exposed up here," Danny said, his voice tight with fear. "If that lightning gets any closer..." Another bolt cut off his words, this one close enough that we could smell the ozone in its wake. The thunder was instantaneous, a crushing wave of sound that made the tent walls flutter like leaves. In the brief moment of electric daylight, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. The bird was much closer now, close enough that I could see details that should have been impossible from such a distance. Its feathers were so black they seemed to absorb light, and its eyes were fixed directly on our tent with an intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But it was the size that truly terrified me. This wasn't a 10-foot wingspan. This creature was easily twice that size, with talons that looked like they could crush a car and a beak that could have torn through steel. It hung motionless in the howling wind, defying physics and common sense, watching us with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished back into the roiling clouds as if it had never been there at all. "Did you see?" I started to ask Danny, but another lightning strike lit up the sky, and this time I could see multiple shapes moving within the storm. Large, dark forms that rode the wind with impossible grace, circling our small refuge like sharks around a sinking ship. We were no longer alone on the mountain. As full darkness fell over the ridge, the storm reached a fever pitch that defied everything I thought I knew about weather. Lightning struck continuously now, turning night into a strobe-lit nightmare where shadows jumped and danced with each electric flash. The thunder had become a constant rumble that we felt in our bones, punctuated by sharp cracks that sounded like the sky itself was breaking apart. Inside our tent, Danny and I huddled in our sleeping bags, trying to project in calm we didn't feel. The LED lantern cast a small circle of warm light that made the violent world outside seem almost unreal. Rain hammered against the tent fabric with machine gun intensity, and the wind howled around us with a voice that sounded almost human, almost like screaming. "This has to be the worst storm I've ever been in," Danny said, his voice barely audible over the chaos outside. He was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tremor of fear underneath his words. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Because it wasn't just the storm that had me terrified. Every few minutes, when the lightning illuminated the sky, I caught glimpses of shapes moving in the clouds above us. Large, dark forms that seemed to be riding the wind currents like surfers on waves. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, tricks of light and shadow playing against my storm-addled brain. But they were too consistent, too purposeful in their movements, and they were getting closer. "I need to check the tent stakes," I said suddenly, the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. Danny looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "In this? You'll get struck by lightning. The wind is getting stronger. If a stake comes loose, we're screwed." It was a reasonable excuse, and partially true. But the real reason I needed to look outside was to confirm what I was seeing in those brief lightning flashes. I had to know if the shapes in the sky were real or if the storm was driving me toward some kind of breakdown. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to stick my head out, and immediately regretted it. The wind-driven rain hit my face like ice-cold needles, and the wind was so strong it felt like invisible hands trying to drag me out of the tent. I squinted through the deluge, waiting for the next lightning strike to illuminate the sky. When it came, I saw them clearly for the first time. 3 massive birds circling overhead, their wings spanning what had to be 20 feet or more. They moved with an impossible grace through the chaotic air, riding updrafts and downdrafts like they were gentle breezes instead of hurricane-force winds. Their feathers were so black they seemed to absorb the lightning itself, and their eyes. Their eyes were focused directly on our tent. I jerked my head back inside and zipped the flap shut with trembling hands. Danny took one look at my face and grabbed my shoulder. "What is it? What did you see?" I opened my mouth to tell him, then closed it again. How do you explain to someone that there are birds the size of small aircraft circling overhead? Birds that shouldn't exist outside of prehistoric times or fever dreams. How do you say that without sounding completely insane? "The stakes look okay," I said instead, but Danny wasn't buying it. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's really going on?" Before I could answer, something brushed against the top of the tent. Not the wind, not a tree branch. Something deliberate and controlled. The fabric dimpled inward as if pressed by enormous talons, then sprang back as whatever it was lifted away. We both stared at the ceiling of the tent, watching for the impression to return. The rain continued to drum overhead, but now every sound seemed potentially significant. Was that just wind? Or was something moving around our campsite? Was that thunder, or something much larger than thunder? Another touch against the tent, this time on the side wall. The fabric pushed inward several inches before snapping back, leaving us both frozen with terror. Whatever was out there was testing our shelter, probing for weakness like a predator examining its prey. "We need to get out of here," Danny whispered, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the storm. "And go where? We're on top of a mountain in the middle of a lightning storm. There's nowhere to run." But even as I said it, I was thinking the same thing. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to flee, to get as far away from this place as possible. The logical part of my brain knew that leaving the tent would be suicide. We'd be exposed to lightning, wind, and rain that could kill us in minutes. But the primitive animal part of my brain didn't care about logic. It only knew that something very large and very dangerous was circling our position, and staying put meant becoming prey. The touching stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving us in tense silence broken only by the storm. We waited. Every muscle coiled for whatever was going to happen next. What happened next was worse than anything I could have imagined. The tent began to rise. At first, I thought the wind had finally gotten under our tent and was trying to tear it from its stakes. The floor beneath us tilted slightly, and I could feel the whole structure shifting. Danny and I scrambled to grab onto something solid, but there was nothing except sleeping bags and camping gear sliding around in the tilted space. Then I realized the movement was too controlled, too purposeful to be wind. The tent was rising straight up, lifting off the ground with a smooth, steady motion that defied every law of physics I understood. Through the fabric walls, I could hear the powerful whooshing of massive wings beating in coordinated rhythm. "What the hell is happening?" Danny screamed, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind and wing beats. I didn't answer because I couldn't process what was happening enough to form words. We were airborne, suspended in a bag of nylon and aluminum poles, carried by something strong enough to lift 2 grown men and all our gear without apparent effort. The tent swayed gently as we rose, like a cradle being rocked by invisible hands. Through the translucent fabric of the tent walls, I could see dark shapes moving around us. Multiple winged forms keeping pace with our ascent, their massive bodies cutting through the storm like it was nothing more than a gentle breeze. Lightning illuminated them in brief, terrifying snapshots, wings that spanned impossible distances, talons that could have crushed cars, eyes that reflected the electric light with cold intelligence. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was impossible. Birds couldn't lift this much weight. Birds this size didn't exist. None of this could be real. But the sensation of flight was undeniable. My stomach lurched with each gentle sway of the tent, and I could feel the pressure change in my ears as we gained altitude. "We're flying," Danny said, his voice flat with shock. "We're actually flying." I looked at him and saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. His face was pale except for 2 bright spots of color on his cheeks, and his hands were shaking as he gripped his sleeping bag. We were both in shock, our minds struggling to accept a reality that violated everything we thought we knew about the world. The flight seemed to last forever and no time at all. We swayed through the storm, lightning flashing all around us, rain drumming against the tent walls like machine gun fire. I could hear the creatures calling to each other, harsh guttural cries that cut through the thunder like knives. There was something almost conversational about their calls, as if they were coordinating their flight, discussing what to do with their strange cargo. Below us, the forest rushed past in brief glimpses revealed by lightning. We were moving fast, much faster than any bird should have been able to fly while carrying such a load. The ridge where we'd camped was already miles behind us, lost in the darkness and rain. "Where are they taking us?" Danny asked, his voice cracking with fear. I had no answer. I could only hold on and try not to think about what would happen when this impossible flight ended. The creatures carrying us were intelligent enough to coordinate their actions, strong enough to lift incredible weight, and large enough to tear us apart without effort. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. But that meant they wanted us alive, at least for now, and that thought was somehow even more terrifying. The tent suddenly lurched sideways, sending us tumbling across the floor. Through the walls, I could hear one of the creatures making a different sound, not a call to its companions, but something that sounded almost like laughter. The cold, cruel amusement of a predator playing with its food. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the flight ended. We hit something solid, a tree branch, I realized, and the tent tore open with a sound like ripping cloth. The aluminum poles bent and snapped as we crashed through layers of pine boughs, our strange aerial cradle disintegrating around us. Danny and I tumbled out of the remains of our shelter, falling through darkness and rain and the reaching branches of ancient trees. I hit the ground hard, my left shoulder taking most of the impact. Pain shot through my body as I rolled across wet leaves and forest debris, finally coming to rest against the massive trunk of an oak tree. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the immediate agony of the landing. Rain poured down through the forest canopy, soaking through my clothes and mixing with the blood from dozens of small cuts where branches had torn at my skin. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel warmth trickling down my face from a gash on my forehead. "Danny!" I called out, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the storm. "Danny, where are you?" "Here," came a weak reply from somewhere off to my left. "I'm here. I think my leg is messed up." I forced myself to sit up, ignoring the stabbing pain in my shoulder and ribs. Through the darkness and rain, I could barely make out Danny's form about 20 feet away, slumped against the base of another tree. He was moving, which meant he was alive, but I could see even from this distance that something was wrong with the way he was positioned. Above us, through gaps in the forest canopy, I could see dark shapes circling against the storm-lit sky. Our captors were still there, still watching, still waiting for something. The flight might be over, but our ordeal was just beginning. I tried to stand and immediately collapsed as my left leg gave out beneath me. Looking down, I could see my ankle was already swelling inside my boot, probably sprained or worse from the impact. We were both injured, lost in the middle of a forest during the worst storm either of us had ever experienced, and somewhere above us were creatures that shouldn't exist carrying out some unknowable agenda. For the first time since this nightmare began, I truly understood how completely helpless we were. Dawn came slowly through the forest canopy, gray light filtering through layers of wet leaves and fog. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a world that felt washed clean and eerily quiet. Birds sang tentatively from hidden perches, their normal morning chorus subdued as if they too were recovering from the violence of the previous night. I awoke to find myself curled against the oak tree where I'd fallen, my clothes soaked through and my body stiff with cold and pain. Every movement sent sharp reminders through my injured shoulder and ankle, but I was alive. More importantly, I could hear Danny breathing heavily about 20 feet away, which meant he had survived the night as well. "Danny?" I called softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace of the morning. "How are you holding up?" He groaned and shifted position, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. "Feel like I got hit by a truck. My shoulder's definitely dislocated, and I think I've got a concussion." "You?" I took inventory of my injuries as I carefully tested each limb. "Sprained ankle, maybe some cracked ribs, and I'm pretty sure I need stitches in my forehead. But we're alive." "Yeah," Danny said quietly. "We're alive." Neither of us mentioned what had happened during the storm. In the rational light of morning, the memories seemed impossible, like fragments of a shared nightmare brought on by injury and shock. But the evidence was all around us. Our destroyed tent hung in tatters from tree branches 30 feet above the ground, our gear scattered across hundreds of yards of forest floor, and both of us bearing injuries that were far too severe to have been caused by simply being blown around by wind. I forced myself to stand, using the oak tree for support as I tested my weight on the injured ankle. The pain was manageable if I was careful, and I could see that Danny was trying to do the same with his dislocated shoulder. We were both in rough shape, but we were mobile. "We need to find water," I said, looking around at the dense forest that surrounded us. "And figure out where the hell we are." The landscape was completely unfamiliar. We were in a deep valley surrounded by steep forested hills that blocked most of the sky. Massive trees towered overhead, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter and their canopies so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. This wasn't the area where we'd been camping. We were somewhere much deeper in the wilderness, somewhere that looked like it hadn't seen human presence in decades. Danny managed to get to his feet, cradling his injured arm against his chest. His face was pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes were alert and focused. "Listen," he said, tilting his head toward the sound of running water somewhere in the distance. "Stream's that way." We gathered what gear we could find scattered around the crash site. Most of it was destroyed or unusable, but I managed to salvage a water purification pump, some energy bars, and a first aid kit that had somehow survived intact. Danny found his knife and compass, both essential for wilderness survival. The hike to the stream took nearly an hour, with both of us moving slowly and carefully over the uneven terrain. Every step was agony for me, and I could see that Danny was fighting waves of nausea that suggested a serious head injury. But the sound of running water drew us forward, promising relief and the beginning of a plan to get out of this nightmare. The stream was larger than I'd expected, a fast-moving creek about 10 feet wide that sparkled in the morning sunlight. The water was clear and cold, and after testing it with my purification tablets, we both drank deeply and washed the worst of the blood and dirt from our injuries. As I cleaned the gash on my forehead, I caught sight of something that made my breath catch in my throat. On the muddy bank on the opposite side of the stream, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a track unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was clearly made by a bird, but the scale was all wrong. The three-toed print was nearly 2 feet long, with talon marks that gouged inches deep into the mud. "Danny," I said quietly, pointing across the water. "Look at that." He followed my gaze and went very still. For a long moment, we both stared at the impossible track, trying to process what it meant. The print was fresh, probably made sometime during the night while we lay unconscious in the forest. Whatever had left it was real, massive, and had been very close to where we'd fallen. "We need to get out of here," Danny said, his voice tight with renewed fear. "Right now." I nodded, but part of me knew it was already too late. We were injured, lost, and stranded in a wilderness that was home to creatures that shouldn't exist. Even if we could find our way back to civilization, who would believe our story? Who would take seriously a tale of giant birds that could lift full-grown men and carry them for miles through a thunderstorm? As we prepared to leave the stream, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. From somewhere high above the forest canopy came a long, mournful cry that echoed off the surrounding hills. It was answered by another call from a different direction, then another, until the air was filled with the haunting voices of creatures that belonged in nightmares rather than the real world. They were still out there, still watching, still waiting. And we were still very much their prey. For 3 days, we struggled through the dense forest, following the stream downstream in hopes that it would eventually lead to civilization. My ankle had stiffened into a constant throb that made each step a conscious act of will, while Danny fought through waves of dizziness and nausea that suggested his head injury was more serious than either of us wanted to admit. The forest around us felt alive with hidden watchers. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, every bird call made us freeze and scan the canopy overhead. We'd found more tracks along the stream, massive three-toed prints that appeared with disturbing regularity, always fresh, always nearby. Whatever these creatures were, they were following us, pacing our slow progress through their territory like wolves shadowing a wounded deer. On the morning of the 4th day, our luck ran out. I was kneeling by the stream, refilling our water bottles when Danny grabbed my arm with sudden urgency. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look up, slowly." I raised my eyes toward the forest canopy and felt my blood turn to ice. Perched on a massive branch about 50 feet above us was something that my mind refused to process as real. It was a bird, but scaled to impossible proportions. Its body was easily the size of a small car, covered in feathers so black they seemed to absorb light. Its head was turned toward us with predatory focus, and its eyes, God help me, its eyes held an intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The creature studied us with the patience of something that had no doubt about the outcome of this encounter. Its talons, each one longer than my forearm, gripped the tree branch with casual strength that I knew could snap our spines without effort. When it shifted its weight slightly, the entire tree swayed under its mass. "Back away," I breathed to Danny, not taking my eyes off the monster above us. Slowly. No sudden movements. We began to edge away from the stream, moving with careful, deliberate steps that we hoped wouldn't trigger the predator's hunting instincts. But we'd only gone a few yards when a second cry echoed through the forest, answered immediately by a third from another direction. They had us surrounded. The bird above us tilted its head, studying our retreat with what looked almost like amusement. Then it opened its beak and released a call that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, a sound that was part screech, part roar, and part something else that had no name in any human language. The noise hit us like a physical force, so loud and penetrating that it felt like it was tearing apart our eardrums. The call was answered immediately from multiple directions. They were closing in. "Run," I said to Danny, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "What?" "Run!" We crashed through the underbrush like panicked animals, all thoughts of stealth abandoned in favor of pure speed. Behind us, I could hear the massive wing beats as our pursuer launched itself from its perch, followed by the splintering crash of branches as it powered through the canopy in pursuit. My ankle screamed with every step, but terror drove me forward through pain that should have dropped me to the ground. Danny stayed close beside me despite his head injury, both of us running with the desperate energy of prey that knows it's being hunted by something infinitely more powerful. The forest became a blur of green and brown as we fled, ducking under low branches and leaping over fallen logs. Behind us, the sound of pursuit grew louder, not just one creature now, but several, their calls echoing back and forth as they coordinated their hunt. I could hear trees groaning and snapping as massive bodies forced their way through the canopy above our heads. A shadow passed overhead, and I looked up to see one of the creatures diving toward us with wings pulled back like a fighter jet. I grabbed Danny and threw both of us sideways just as enormous talons raked the air where we'd been standing. The creature pulled up at the last second, its wing beats creating a downdraft so powerful it nearly knocked us flat. "This way!" Danny shouted, pointing toward what looked like a thicker section of forest where the trees grew closer together. If we could get somewhere the creatures couldn't follow. We changed direction, crashing through a wall of undergrowth that tore at our clothes and skin. The canopy above was so thick here that it was nearly dark despite the midday sun, and the trunks of ancient trees pressed close together like the pillars of some primordial cathedral. For a moment, I thought we might have found sanctuary. The trees were too close together for creatures that size to maneuver, and the thick canopy would make diving attacks impossible. We collapsed against the trunk of a massive oak, gasping for breath and listening to the frustrated cries of our pursuers as they circled overhead. But our relief was short-lived. From somewhere in the darkness ahead of us came a sound that made my heart stop. The careful, deliberate footsteps of something very large moving through the forest floor. Whatever was hunting us, at least one of them was on the ground now, stalking us through the undergrowth with the patience of a true predator. We were trapped between the creatures above and the one approaching through the shadows ahead. Our desperate flight had only delayed the inevitable. In that moment, as I listened to death approaching from multiple directions, I found myself thinking about all the people who would never know what happened to us. Our parents, who would wait for phone calls that would never come. Search and rescue teams who would comb these forests for weeks without finding so much as a trace of our passage. They would never believe the truth. And perhaps that was for the best. The creature stalking us through the undergrowth moved with deliberate patience, each footstep carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Only the subtle sound of massive weight shifting from foot to foot revealed its presence as it drew closer to our hiding place. Danny and I pressed ourselves against the trunk of the oak tree, hardly daring to breathe as our pursuer closed the distance between us. Above, the cries of the circling birds had taken on a different tone, less urgent hunting calls, and more like communication between pack members coordinating for a kill. They knew we were trapped. They were taking their time, savoring the moment before the final strike. That's when we heard the distant rumble of engines. At first, I thought it was thunder from another approaching storm, but the sound was too steady, too mechanical, and it was growing steadily louder. Helicopter engines, multiple aircraft, coming our direction fast. The reaction from our hunters was immediate and startling. The footsteps in the undergrowth stopped completely, and the cries from above took on a note of alarm rather than predatory satisfaction. Through gaps in the canopy, I caught glimpses of massive dark shapes launching themselves skyward, climbing rapidly toward the higher altitudes where helicopters couldn't follow. "Search and rescue," Danny breathed, hardly daring to hope. The sound of rotors grew louder, and I could hear voices calling through bullhorns, though the words were indistinct through the thick forest canopy. Somewhere relatively nearby, people were looking for us. We'd been missing long enough for someone to organize an official search operation. But our ordeal wasn't over yet. The creature that had been stalking us on foot was still out there, and I could sense its presence like a weight pressing against my consciousness. It hadn't fled like the others. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, perhaps hoping the helicopters would pass and leave us to our fate. The sound of the aircraft reached its peak directly overhead, then began to fade as they continued their search pattern in another direction. In the renewed silence, I heard the footsteps resume, closer now, moving with renewed urgency as if the creature understood this might be its last chance. "We have to signal them," I whispered to Danny, "before they get too far away." He nodded and pulled out his emergency whistle, a small but piercing device designed to cut through forest noise. The blast of sound seemed impossibly loud in the confined space under the canopy, and I knew it would carry far enough to reach the search aircraft if anyone was listening. The response was immediate and violent. Something massive crashed through the underbrush toward us, no longer concerned with stealth now that stealth was impossible. I caught a glimpse of it between the trees, a nightmare of black feathers and razor talons moving with terrifying speed despite its enormous size. Danny blew the whistle again, a long, sustained blast that echoed through the forest like a scream. Above us, one of the helicopters suddenly changed direction, its engine note shifting as it turned back toward our position. The creature burst into the small clearing where we huddled, and for one heart-stopping moment, I found myself face to face with something that had stepped out of humanity's oldest nightmares. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, even with its neck bent under the low canopy, its head cocked at an angle that suggested both intelligence and predatory calculation. Its eyes were the worst part. Too knowing, too aware, too full of an alien intelligence that had no place in the natural world. Then the helicopter was directly overhead, its rotor wash bending trees and filling the air with flying debris. A spotlight beam lanced down through the canopy, sweeping back and forth until it found us. In that brilliant circle of light, the creature froze like a deer caught in headlights, its impossible form clearly visible for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it was gone, vanishing into the shadows between the trees with a speed that defied its massive size. The forest fell silent except for the thunderous noise of the helicopter hovering overhead and the voices of rescuers calling down to us through bullhorns. The rest of our rescue was almost anticlimactic. We were airlifted to a regional medical center where doctors treated our injuries and officials took our statements about being caught in a severe storm and separated from our gear. We told them about getting disoriented in the forest, about struggling to survive for several days, about the difficult terrain and dangerous weather conditions. We didn't mention the birds. The official report concluded that we had been the victims of unusual wind conditions associated with the severe thunderstorm that had passed through the area. Our tent had been destroyed by straight-line winds, and we had been injured while seeking shelter. Disoriented and possibly suffering from mild hypothermia, we had wandered for several days before being located by the search and rescue operation. It was a reasonable explanation. It accounted for all the physical evidence and fit within the boundaries of what rational people could accept. The fact that it was completely wrong didn't seem to matter to anyone except Danny and me. We never talked about what really happened that night, not to anyone else and barely to each other. Who would believe such a story? Giant birds that could lift grown men and carry them through thunderstorms belonged in fantasy novels, not incident reports filed with state authorities. But I know what I saw. I know what carried us through that storm, what hunted us through the forest, what studied us with intelligence that had no place in the natural world. Somewhere in the deep wilderness of southeastern Oklahoma, there are creatures that exist outside the accepted boundaries of reality, ancient things that have learned to avoid human contact but occasionally reveal themselves to those unlucky enough to venture too far into their domain. I still live in Oklahoma, still love the wide open spaces and dramatic weather of the Great Plains. But I haven't been camping since that October night in 2019, and I never will again. Some experiences change you in ways that can't be undone, leave you with knowledge that you can never share and memories that you can never escape. The wilderness is beautiful, magnificent, and alive with wonders beyond human understanding. It's also home to things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Creatures that remind us that for all our technology and civilization, we are still very small and very vulnerable in a world that holds secrets we were never meant to discover. Danny recovered fully from his injuries and moved to Colorado, where he works as a software engineer and avoids any outdoor activities more strenuous than walking in city parks. We talk occasionally, careful conversations that dance around the edges of shared trauma without ever approaching the core of what happened to us in those dark woods. Sometimes on stormy nights when lightning flickers across the Oklahoma sky, I find myself watching the clouds and wondering what rides the wind currents high above the prairie. I tell myself that what happened to us was an isolated incident, a chance encounter with something rare and reclusive that will never cross human paths again. But deep down, I know better. They're still out there, patient and waiting, watching our small human dramas play out beneath skies that belong to them far more than they belong to us. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right and someone ventures too far from the safety of civilization, they remind us exactly who rules the ancient places of the world. The mountains remember, the forests remember. And somewhere in the storm-torn skies above Oklahoma, creatures older than human memory continue their eternal flight through clouds that hide more secrets than we could ever imagine. God help anyone who stumbles into their domain unprepared.